Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 184 and the third seminar in the series on the European Eurostudent project, which is led by Rachel Brooks, who's going to give today's paper. The topic of today's webinar is European Higher Education Students Contested Constructions. Rachel is a professor of sociology at Surrey and a member of the governing council of the Society for Research into Higher Education. She's also a member of the education subpanel for REF 2021, which of course gives her an immense importance in the next few months in relation to the field of education studies. And I should imagine a quite enormous workload as well, Rachel. But great that you can develop our understanding of this project today. I mean, we've had two really good webinars on it from it already, and considerable interest in both of those. So we look forward to your presentation and to the discussion. Let me take you through the webinar protocols, folks. This webinar is being recorded, as they all are, and it will be posted on the CG website and on YouTube within the next 48 hours or so. In fact, Trevor usually gets it up quite quickly. Also, you will find there the chat from today's webinar as well, often an important part of the discussion and worth keeping and worth reading. Now, there's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. Please keep yourself muted so we won't pick up all the background noise in wherever you are until you've been asked to speak, as in the Q&A session when we bring you in to ask your question. We recommend using the speaker view in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given time. To ask a question, use the chat function initially, type your question out, insert it into the chat, either for me or for everyone to see. And that will enable me to compose a Q&A list after Rachel has finished presenting. It's a good idea to raise your question relatively early in this process. Good questions that come in the last 10 minutes or so do sometimes miss out from becoming part of the discussion, which is always a pity. When you're invited to ask your question, please unmute yourself, most important step. Switch on your video, and then when you come in, state your name and where you are from. At this point, Rachel, really pleased to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, okay. So it's a pleasure to be here today and to give another talk from the Eurostudents project. The talk I'm going to give today was developed with Jessie Abrahams at the University of Bristol, who did a lot of the data collection for this particular strand of the project. So I'm really grateful to her for her insights. To start with a little bit of background, I think in the wider literature on the sociology of higher education students, there's an argument that across the world over recent decades, higher education systems have become more similar as a result of processes associated with neoliberalisation and marketisation, and what Jane Kenway has discussed in relation to the kind of commodification of learning. And it's been argued that as a result of these kind of structural changes, students themselves have become increasingly similar and increasingly positioned as instrumental employment-focused consumers as a result of various specific policy technologies, such as the introduction of fees in many parts of the world and high fees in some countries, associated policy discourses that often construct students in consumer-like ways. And also, as Joanna Williams has argued, the redefinition of education as a means to various non-educational ends, many of which are associated with the labour market. And Molesworth and colleagues have argued that this has had a direct impact on students' attitudes to learning. So they argue that in relation to the UK, the inculcation of a consumer identity has brought about a more passive approach to learning, in which students place much more emphasis on their rights rather than their responsibilities, and on having a degree rather than being a learner. And when we turn to Europe specifically, we can see rather similar arguments about the similarity of students being played out. So, for example, I think there are certain assumptions implicit in the Erasmus scheme that students can move unproblematically across national borders, and that the experience of being a student is broadly similar wherever you go in Europe. And then I think it's argued that processes such as the Bologna process and the creation of a European higher education area have made the structures within Europe much more similar. And Slaughter and Cantor have argued that we've seen the kind of reverse engineering of an Anglo-American model across Europe and the loss of national distinctiveness in higher education models. And it's argued again that these kind of structural changes have had an impact on students' subjectivities. So Stavros Moutsios, for example, has argued in his analysis of the Bologna process that the introduction of corporate management through this process has disintegrated the academic community. He argues it's subdued the staff as a workforce under surveillance and has positioned students as consumers. So within this literature, there's this argument that we've seen quite significant structural changes which have fed through into the ways in which students understand themselves. But I think at this point, it's also important to note some kind of caution about such arguments. So not everybody agrees with this analysis. So some have argued that higher education policies are not always translated simply into student subjectivities. And Grit Nielsen has done some interesting work on that in relation to the Danish context. Similarly, others have argued that European higher education policy can sometimes act primarily as a kind of cultural script, which national actors pick and choose from depending on their own national priorities. And then finally, it's argued that we shouldn't always see nations as kind of coherent educational entities. There can be quite significant contestations within national borders as to what it means to be a student. And so there have been some interesting studies looking at kind of how those differences can be played out by institutions within individual nations, but also within individual institutions between different groups of students, often related to their socioeconomic characteristics. So the Eurostudents project, which Simon mentioned, is trying to engage with this debate. And one of our research questions is how do students of different national backgrounds understand the role of the higher education student? And as part of this, how do they understand their own identity as a higher education student? And so to answer this question, we've collected data in 6 nations, which have been chosen on the basis of their differences in welfare regimes, means of funding higher education, and relationships to the European Union. So we've collected data in Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. And in each country, we've chosen 3 higher education institutions to try to reflect some of the diversity of provision in each country. And then in each institution, we've conducted 3 focus groups with undergraduate students. So a total of 54 focus groups with 295 students in total. And one of the things that we asked them to do in the focus groups was to produce a plasticine model to represent how they understood themselves as a student. And it's this data that I'm going to be focusing on today, because although it's only a small slice of the data that we collected, it was quite a good technique for getting them to focus on, the kind of main way in which they saw themselves. As part of the broader project, we also collected data about constructions of students within policy, by institutions and by higher education staff, and also within national media. And I'll refer to some of those kind of data sources a little bit in this presentation, but I'm happy to answer more about them in the question and answer session, because I'll only be touching on some of those broader data sources. So today, really, I want to talk about some of the dominant constructions of students that emerged from our focus groups and from the plasticine models specifically. And I don't have time to go through them all today, but I'm going to talk about some of the quite striking similarities across all 6 nations. And I'm going to talk in particular about students as learners and students as hard workers that came through really strongly in the data. But then I'm also going to talk about a few cross-national differences, such as students as depressed, disappointed and critical, as consumers or consumer products, and just like anybody else. There were also some quite interesting differences by institution, particularly in Spain and England. I don't have time to talk about those in this presentation, but really happy to answer questions about them afterwards if you're interested. Okay, so to start with, the first construction I want to talk about is students as learners. Now, in all 6 countries in the sample, numerous focus group participants made plasticine models that represented in some way the learning they were undertaking and how they saw this as fundamental to what it meant to them to be a student. And these models included books, laptops, brains, trees and flowers. And there were also a number of models of pathways indicative of the student suggested moving forwards, although sometimes to an unknown destination. There were lots and lots of examples of this, but I've just chosen 2 to show you today. So the first one is a book, the one on the left, produced by a student in England. And that student said, I've been really surprised by how much I feel like my subject has come to define me, and how much genuinely of what I talk about is about my subject and things I've discovered that I'm really interested in, and to be proud of that. And then the second one is from a student in Denmark who said, and mine is this little fellow with a big brain. You get a lot of knowledge all the time, and sometimes your brain is bigger than your face and you can't control it. So this emphasis on learning and the acquisition of knowledge was evident even in those countries with more marketized systems, such as England. And this centrality of learning contrasted quite strongly with the notable absence of models that foregrounded employment, understanding students primarily as future workers, or which constructed students in more instrumental terms. And so here, there are clear differences from the dominant narratives within policy. Within the Eurostudents project, our analysis of higher education policies across Europe has shown how the construction of student as future worker is often dominant, and that of student as learner frequently marginal or not evident at all. While our staff data show the prevalence of understanding students as largely instrumental in their approach to their studies. There are also clear contrasts with the ways in which students are often discussed in the literature, as I was indicating earlier, with some scholars presenting them as first and foremost consumers aware of their rights. The emphasis on the value of knowledge and truth, even in supposedly post-truth times, evident within the students' narratives, diverges quite considerably from William's argument that with respect to the UK in particular, the liberal purpose of higher education, i.e. the focus on knowledge for its own sake, has been squeezed out as a result of the use of the university system for other ends. And so in general, a very positive view of higher education was conveyed by the students in our sample, valued primarily for its impact on their intellect and view of the world. While representing themselves as learners or engaged with knowledge was the most common way in which participants talked about themselves, another common representation across most of the countries was of themselves as hard workers. Students typically emphasised the demanding amount and level of work that was required of them by their courses and how they had risen to this challenge, as illustrated by the 2 examples on the slide. So on the left, we have a student with a laptop sort of attached to their head. And they said, that's me with the laptop. That's basically what I do all day. That's how I fall asleep. That's how I wake up. Basically, I study, I program. That's it. There's not much else, and there's not much time for anything else. And that was from a student in Ireland. And then the other model is a snake eating its own tail. And the student said, even though I'm moving forward, I might be learning more, but then I realize I need to learn more and I still need to improve. So this kind of continuing cycle of needing to learn more. And although some students acknowledged that hard work could lead to tiredness, a lack of time for other pursuits and other negative consequences, most tended to discuss it in positive or at least neutral terms, with many appearing proud of the commitment that they were showing to their degree programmes. While various commentators have argued that under conditions of marketisation, students have increasingly come to see a degree as a product to be bought rather than a process of learning which requires effort on their part. These models suggest that not only did our focus group participants view the process of learning as central to their understandings of what it means to be a student, but they also viewed it as not always easy and often requiring considerable effort. And in general, there was no attempt to position themselves as effortless achievers as a means of demonstrating their authentic intelligence, as has been demonstrated in numerous studies of compulsory education and some of higher education. And instead, the students' narratives would appear to offer some support to Heather Mendick and colleagues' contention that for many young people under conditions of what they call austere meritocracy, hard work has come to be seen as a key moral imperative. And by this, they mean that the emphasis on working hard often reflects the language of politicians, in which the appeal to hard work has been to shore up the idea of meritocracy and deflect responsibility for social inequalities back to individuals, those who don't work sufficiently hard. And within higher education policy specifically, the idea of hard work has indeed been discussed by politicians and other social actors. In England, for example, an implicit contrast is drawn between those students who work hard and are thoroughly deserving of their degree outcome, and others who have not shown such commitment to their studies and yet have been unfairly rewarded with a good degree as a result of so-called grade inflation. And similarly in Denmark, the figure of the lazy student has been used as a foil for introducing a range of reforms intended to encourage students to move through their studies at a faster pace. While across Europe more generally, reforms associated with the Bologna process have sought to increase the efficiency with which students move through their higher education, with implied consequences for how hard they're expected to work. And it's thus possible that such discourses serve to underline the expectation of hard work, but also through the assertion that some are lazy, provoke a reaction from students in which individuals are at pains to stress their hardworking nature. I'm now going to move on to talk about a few areas in which students' representations differed between countries. So the first is students as depressed, disappointed and critical, which was seen only in Spain. So most of the models, including the ones I've just been talking about, conveyed a very positive understanding of what it meant to be a higher education student. But it was really striking that part of the Spanish sample was really different in this respect. They tended to be critical of the higher education experience they're receiving and pessimistic about where their degree would lead them. And so just two examples here for you of that. On the left, one of the Spanish students produced this kind of abstract image, I guess, where they said, "I see myself alone in the middle of nothing. I have no idea about anything, nor how I'm going to finish what I'm studying, nor what to do afterwards, nor what I like." And then on the right, the student described this model as, "I've made a kind of dead figure, like a skull. I don't know if you can see it, but the face is a skull and it's dragging itself along in desperation because it's trying to arrive and it can't. And it has wings, but they are drooping." And the contrast with the models produced in the other 5 countries is striking. And as a team, we were trying to think about, kind of what might explain the very significant differences between the data we collected in Spain and the other 5 countries. And we think that perhaps the most plausible explanation for this national difference lies within the labour market. At the time of our data collection, which was in 2017 to 2018, the youth unemployment rate in Spain was 34.3%, more than double the EU average of 15.2%, and the highest of all the countries in our study by over 20%. And Spain was also one of only 4 EU member states with the highest rate of graduate unemployment, while all the other countries in our sample had a graduate unemployment rate below the EU average. And although the quotations on the previous slide don't make specific reference to the labour market, I think it is implicit in their comments about having no idea what to do afterwards and trying to arrive, but it can't. But some participants were more direct, noting that there were insufficient jobs available for all those who graduated with good grades. And I think this is represented quite well in the example that I've put on the slide here. So the student says, "I've made a briefcase which symbolises work and a tick which represents good qualifications and grades. All is encircled, but there's a narrow opening. So I see myself as one of the thousands of young Spanish people who work, who study, who get good results. But in the end, we are all inside the same circle, and there is only a narrow exit. So it's a competition, more and more, always more. It's never enough. Spanish students' dissatisfaction appeared also to be linked to what they perceived to be the high fees many of them were paying, combined with the poor quality education they were receiving. Although fees were considerably higher in England at the time of our study, these did not have to be paid up front, and in general, English students were much more content with their degree programme. And I think this student here alludes to this kind of feeling in their comments. They say, well, mine is like a sad and frustrated doll, because I believe they have to change the teaching methodology that they use in class. It has to be more dynamic, different, not the typical one of coming here, sitting down and listening to all they tell you. So that was the first national difference that differentiated Spain from the other 5 countries. And a second difference, which was also evident in Spain, related to discussions of consumerism. And it was really only in the Spanish focus groups that the plasticine models made specific reference to the marketisation of higher education and the implications participants believed this had for understandings of what it means to be a student. And so 2 examples here where students talk about themselves as kind of consumer products. So the first one talks about with the learning that they've done, they get to the top of the slide, but then when they get to that position, they realise that they have various problems and they end up feeling like a consumer product for the system. And then the second example is quite similar. The student says, I feel about myself as if I was what I have tried to make, a cardboard box to show that I feel like a piece of merchandise in this educational situation, which in the end is more of an attempt at the commercialisation of education than learning. And in many ways, this foregrounding of consumerism with respect to the Spanish models, but not in the focus groups in any of the other countries, is curious, as marketisation is more firmly established in several other of the nations, and in England in particular. And indeed, our analysis of higher education institutional websites, which we've done as part of the broader project, has indicated that Spanish students, unlike their counterparts in England, Ireland, and Denmark, are not addressed as consumers, but as either novices in an academic community or as recipients of a public service. Moreover, the Spanish policymakers who we interviewed tended to be really strongly opposed to a consumerist discourse, while marketisation with respect to students is also discussed very little in the media in Spain that we've also looked at. Now, in seeking to explain the distinctiveness of the Spanish responses in this respect, it's possible that the stage of marketisation is significant. In England, for example, market reforms and consumer discourse are now firmly established. University websites clearly address students as consumers, and policy documents are infused with market logic. In such circumstances, ideas associated with marketisation may have become so normalised that they're not worthy of comment by students. In Spain, however, there may be heightened sensitivity and resistance to such ideas because they are relatively new and not yet firmly established in all parts of the higher education system. And I think this reflects to some extent Manuel Klemenschik's argument that national political norms can affect not only what is seen as a kind of an acceptable education policy, but also what is conversely met with resistance and opposition. Spanish students may also be aware of the trajectory taken by higher education systems elsewhere in Europe and keen to avoid shifting to a highly marketised system. The distinctiveness of Spanish data may also relate to the way in which higher education is funded. As I mentioned earlier in relation to the previous construction, fees are relatively high in Spain and payable upfront by a large proportion of the student population. However, unlike in other countries where relatively high fees are payable, in our sample, this included England and Ireland, in Spain, there was also widespread dissatisfaction with the quality of the education that was received. And it seems that this combination may cause more students to question the basis for fees, i.e. a consumer system in which higher education is understood at least partially as an individual good, than in nations where students are broadly happy with the education they're receiving. want to move on now to a third national difference in our sample, and this isn't from Spain, this is from Poland. Now in Poland, students were broadly in line with their counterparts in the 5 other nations in the sample, in emphasising the importance of learning and hard work to their understandings of what it meant to be a student, and their relatively upbeat assessment of their lives. But they differed from their counterparts in other countries in suggesting that there was nothing intrinsically different about being a student. Students were just people like everyone else. And this is evident in the model on the left, the red one, where the student says, I've just made a regular person because I think that every student is just a regular person. And the fact that you're attending university doesn't make you special anyway, that's it. Other students in the focus groups focused on particular characteristics they had, which had no obvious connection to being a student. An example of this is the model on the right, the blue one, where the student says, I have formed a person because I see myself as an outgoing person and someone that needs other people to feel good, and I'm always at the centre of attention. Now, these kind of comments were wholly absent from the focus groups in the other 5 countries, where typically all participants considered that there was something specific about being a student if the nature of this differed. And I think this is quite interesting as it corresponds to the lack of discussion of students within the national media in Poland, which has been evidenced through our analysis of newspapers, and also their lack of representation in popular Polish TV shows and films, which we've also looked at. So how might we explain this? So I think perhaps we could start to explain it by considering changes to the higher education system in Poland over the past decade. Poland differs from most of its European neighbours by the sharp rate of increase in higher education participation that's occurred over the past 30 years. In 1989, for example, only 10% of each age cohort progressed to university, whereas now the comparable figure is around 50%. While this current level is not significantly higher than many other European countries, the rate of increase has been notably higher, and this has been discussed quite a lot in the literature. This may have led to a perception among Poles that now everyone is going to higher education, and it's no longer associated with any special social status. And indeed, a recent survey conducted in Poland indicated that 78% of those interviewed believed that everyone can study, perhaps linked not only to the sharp increase in the percentage of each cohort progressing to higher education, but also the ease of accessing most courses, even those in prestigious universities, because of what Marek Quick has described as policies of almost open access, so a kind of a strong perception of ease of access. It's also possible, perhaps, that the students' views may have been formed by communist legacies of the past, in which no elite groups were recognised and individuals were seen as only peasants, workers, or intellectual workers, although there are obvious tensions there with what I've just argued in relation to the kind of changes to the percentage of the cohort moving to higher education. And perhaps it's also linked to the prevalence of paid work alongside studies in the lives of many Polish students. So in Estonia, for example, Birkins et al. Have argued that paid work is much more significant to students than their higher education studies, largely because they believe employers view it as a more important marker of their abilities than their degree result. Although the level of student employment in Poland is similar to that in some of our other countries in the sample, the documented belief among the population at large that a degree has low labour market value may encourage students to foreground their worker identity rather than that associated with their studies. And indeed, research that has asked students who have engaged in paid work alongside their studies, whether they identify primarily as a student or as a worker, has indicated that the percentage choosing the latter, the worker identity, is very high in Poland, over 48%, compared to 25% in Ireland and only 9% in Denmark. And then finally, it also might be linked to institutional assumptions. When we were doing our fieldwork in Poland, the absence of social spaces within universities was striking, and it was also commented on by a number of our interviewees, staff, as well as students. And so again, this kind of might also reinforce a sense that, university isn't somewhere that's important for your social life, it's just a particular part of your life, and other parts are perhaps of equal or greater importance. But again, I think with here, cause and effect are perhaps a little hard to determine. So where does that leave us? Hopefully, I think the data I've been presenting today will speak to debates about European homogenisation, which I talked about in the first part of the presentation. There are clearly some important commonalities in conceptualisations of what it means to be a higher education student amongst our focus group participants from across Europe. And indeed, as I've been explaining, the emphasis on both the centrality of learning and of hard work was evident in most of our 54 focus groups. This suggests that the majority of those involved in our research had a rather less instrumental view of education than is sometimes suggested within the literature, and were committed to putting in a sufficient degree of effort to ensure they got the best out of their degree programme. However, these commonalities can be set against some of the differences that were also evident in our study. As I've been explaining, many Spanish students differed from their counterparts in the other 5 countries in having a markedly less positive view of what it means to be a higher education student. They were also more likely than their peers in other nation states to make reference to ideas associated with consumerism and marketisation. National differences were also evident in Poland, as I've just been talking about, with participants typically conceptualising students as little different from other members of society. In all other countries, students were much more likely to identify a range of characteristics that they thought were specific to higher education students. And I think that these differences do raise questions about the extent to which higher education systems are converging as a result of the Bologna process and the creation of the European higher education area, as scholars such as Moutsios and Slaughter and Cantwell have argued, and which I referenced at the start. And indeed, it seems as though in relation to student understandings, at least, there remain some significant differences which are informed by the particular histories of nation states and their specific social, political and economic contexts. And in Poland, this can be related to short-term effects such as the sharp rate of change in higher education participation rates over the past couple of decades, and perhaps also longer-term factors associated with the transition from communism. Similarly, within Spain, I suggested that contemporary conditions here related to the labour market and specifically the rate of youth and graduate unemployment, as well as the fee regime, may have informed students' understandings. As well as speaking to debates about the degree of coherence and convergence across Europe, I think the data also inform our views about the extent to which nations can be viewed as sharing common understandings. The disconnect that I've alluded to, although not really explored in depth in the presentation, between policy emphases and student understandings does suggest that nations should not necessarily be understood as coherent educational entities. And what it means to be a student in contemporary society can, in some countries, differ quite markedly between policy actors and students themselves. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, some scholars have argued that as a result of market reforms across Europe, students have become increasingly consumerist in their outlook. The plasticine models produced by our participants were generally more ambivalent with respect to such discussions. Although their emphasis on the importance of hard work can perhaps be read as an internalisation of neoliberal imperatives, and in some nations a reflection of the language or reaction to the language used by policymakers, I think this reading is in tension with the non-instrumental focus implicit in the emphasis of many students on their love of learning and their sense that it was this that was central to their identity as higher education students. And in these cases, we can see the strength of more traditional understandings of the purpose of higher education being played out amongst students, which foreground ideas about knowledge acquisition and personal growth rather than labour market readiness. And I think our findings here resonate with those of scholars such as Michael Tomlinson, who have argued that even in countries such as England, where fees are very high and policy tends to focus on developing future workers rather than critical thinkers, students are often quite resistant to being positioned as consumers, believing that it underplays the effort they have to put into their own learning and has an adverse effect on their relationships with their teachers. And I think it's intriguing that understandings of students as consumers or consumer products, in the examples I gave you, came not from the countries that are typically assumed to have the most firmly entrenched market-based systems, such as England, or those where higher education institutions tend to treat students as consumers, Denmark, England, and Ireland, we would suggest, but from Spain, where market reforms have been introduced relatively late and policymakers remain quite resistant to consumer discourse. And in explaining this variation, I've suggested that the broader economic context may be key, and that students may come to understand their position very differently if they're concerned about their labour market outcomes. But it might also be the case that the specific stage of policy implementation is important, with students in Spain more concerned about the impact of marketisation because it has yet to be normalised nationally. And in contrast, in England, market logic has informed the higher education sector for a very long time and may either not be noticed or not deemed, or deemed not worthy of comment by students. So the data that I presented today, I think, indicate that differences between students in different nation states cannot easily be read off policy pronouncements and formal policy positions. Moreover, it suggests that there is not always a straightforward relationship between policy and student subjectivities, and that to understand the experiences of being a student in contemporary Europe, we need to look beyond policy and political rhetoric to the lived experiences of individuals. And if you'd like to find out more about the project, we have a project website. And then the paper that I've given today is based on an article that's been recently published in Sociological Research Online, and the reference is there if you would like to follow it up. But thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And isn't plasticine modelling an effective technique for getting to all kinds of issues? I thought that was really well presented, and you know, the use of the photos on the black background in Zoom really works well. So that was great data set, very, very comprehensible as a result. So we've got a good discussion ahead. Plasticine modelling, interesting to think about its other possible applications to social science problems. I was thinking to myself, how would it be if the Bank of England started to have its discussion about the setting of interest rates on the basis of plasticine modelling? You know, what do you really think about where the economy is at, you know, at the moment? Plasticine model it, please. Just a comment before we go to our first question. The Spanish data, and particularly the sharp critique of consumption and commodity forms in Spain. I recall that when I was a student in Australia in the 1970s, when we paid virtually no fees, only about a third of people were paying a low level of fee, and that was abolished during the time I was a student. And so there was no question of being a formal consumer. There was no rhetoric about being a consumer either. But we talked about ourselves in our critical approach to the university and higher education, which we all had, of being cogs in an economic machine, part of a production line, all these sorts of metaphors about being dominated by an economic discourse of utility and about lack of agency. And so I guess the point I'm making is that if you see these economic terms appearing, they may not come from a consumerist discourse in a marketized system. They can come from a larger critique of a sense of the economic being overplayed as a value set, and also that sense of lack of agency, which must be very strongly felt in Spain because a third of young people can't get jobs and so on. So a sense of hopelessness and so that you know could be playing out here. So I guess, you know, we shouldn't read everything in terms of you know, the marketized systems. In other words, I think that there's excuse me, another way you could use those terms. However, we haven't all come here to, as you said it, I think, and again from Spain, wasn't it, to come here, sit down and listen to all that you tell us. We've come here to discuss it with you. And our first question is from Mokadil Mamaslieva. Mokadil.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Rachel Brooks, for this very insightful, interesting presentation. My first question, actually, I've got two questions. My first question is related to sampling. Did your sampling of students included international, non-European students too? If yes, have you identified differences or commonalities in how international non-European students and European or home students construct themselves? So what were the differences and commonalities? And what about differences and commonalities between disciplines? So for instance, social science and hard sciences students, did they position or construct themselves similarly or in different way? And my second question is somehow related to my own research interest. Had this 6-year-long project dealt with or touched upon issues of the political engagement of students? I'm particularly interested in the international mobile students in the European countries. I wonder how students position or construct themselves with regard to the political engagement. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you very much. Lots of questions there. First of all, in relation to the sampling, I made a decision when I was constructing the project to exclude international students, even though a lot of my career has been focused on exploring international students. I felt they were the questions that I wanted to explore were about national students and how they understood themselves with respect to how other national actors were understanding them. Because I think that if we had included international students, a lot of very different issues would have cropped up. So I think that's still a very worthy topic of investigation, but one that we had to draw the parameters around for this project. And so we chose to exclude international students. So in Spain, all the students were Spanish nationals. In England, all UK nationals. So that was one of the selection criteria that we stuck to quite strongly. And but I appreciate that there are lots of interesting differences I'm sure would have occurred if we'd had focus groups with international students. Then you had a question about kind of differences across disciplines, and that's a really interesting question. I think in relation to the plasticine models, which was really a method of forcing students to decide what they felt was most important about their identity, there weren't differences there. But across the broader focus group data, there certainly were. And I think, and this is something that we're kind of writing about in the book that we're writing from the project at the moment, that there were really big differences between STEM students and non-STEM students in nearly, well, I think in all of our countries, where non-STEM students actually felt quite stigmatized by how they were represented in policy, by how they were thought about by other people, and also in terms of really genuine worries about their labour market trajectory. And that wasn't just in Spain, that was in a lot of the other countries too. And so I think that is a theme that is really important from our data, the big disciplinary differences that do feed into how students feel about themselves. And I think, certainly in the UK at the moment, there's a lot of very contemporary policy that's like this. And I think our data has shown that students are really sensitive to that kind of positioning, and students who choose to do non-STEM subjects, it does increase their anxiety quite a bit. So I think that's an interesting point. And then your final question was about the political engagement of students. And that was something that we were really keen to explore, because in the focus groups, one of the things, we asked a lot of sort of very open-ended questions to start with about how they understood what it meant to be a student. But then towards the end of the focus group, we asked them all about specific constructions that we see in the literature. So we asked them about future worker, about learner, about consumer. And the other one that we asked about was about political actor. So we did ask them explicitly about that. And we've written a couple of papers about that. But just to sort of summarize very generally, I think across all of our countries, there was a sense that students did have a lot of interest in politics and a desire to be politically active and to have a voice on issues. But generally, they felt that they were kind of ignored by politicians, or that, sometimes it wasn't worth speaking out. That was the very general picture. But there were also some quite interesting national variations on that. So for example, in Denmark, where there's been quite a strong history of students' unions being very involved in the running of universities and in politics more generally, I think students there tended to have a more optimistic perspective on the efficacy of students as political actors. And our newspaper analysis is quite interesting, because in the Danish newspapers, students have a much stronger voice on whatever issue they're discussing than, you know, in the other countries. So although I've given you a broad picture, there were some quite interesting national variations. And I can, on our project website, we've got all the publications, and you'll see the two that are about political engagement there.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sorry for so many questions.
Well done, Mokadul. You got 3 questions for the price of 1 there. But that was great because a lot of issues came out. That was very helpful, actually. Our next question is from Peter Scott.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Rachel. That was really interesting. I'm sure your broad conclusion that any link between kind of policy discourse and student constructions of themselves is fairly loose at best. I mean, you could, of course, construct a kind of home internationals comparison between England and Scotland. I mean, obviously the policy discourse is very different in Scotland, but I'd be very surprised if there was any significant difference in the way that Scottish and English students saw their identities. The question I wanted to ask, though, was about Poland. And the rather sort of surprising idea maybe that the Polish students didn't see themselves as anything special while students in other countries did. I was wondering whether the fact that Poland has a large number of students in private institutions might have been a factor there. Maybe attending a private institution, a private college, doesn't have the same kind of resonance. It's not such a big deal as someone who's attending the University of Krakow with grand buildings and so on. So is that a factor? And was one of the institutions you chose in Poland a private institution, or were they all public? I know that this wouldn't be an issue in the other 5 countries you chose. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. No, that's a good question. We did hope to have a private Polish institution in our sample, but for various logistical reasons, we couldn't secure one. So the 3 institutions in Poland are public, which I think, you know, is a kind of limitation of our data to some extent, because we had hoped to have a private institution. But I think that does then, you know, kind of suggest that even students in public institutions tended to have this view. But I think your point is an important one, because I think the growth of private higher education institutions in Poland, I think there is this kind of normalization of work alongside studies. And so even though our focus groups were in public institutions, I think there was a sense that, you know, they were all working, you know, studying certainly wasn't the only thing that they were doing. And so, you know, I mean, that would be just speculation, but whether that kind of the huge growth of the private sector has led to the normalization of work alongside studies to, you know, to cover the costs. And that has fed through into attitudes of students more broadly. But certainly, yes, the students in our sample were all in public institutions, but did still seem to have this view that still they were nothing special.
Thank you. Thank you. That rather shoots down my theory that I just suggested, but thank you.
I think, Simon, you were muted just then, but if it's my question, then I'll go for it.
You're entirely right, Helen.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Rachel. Really, really interesting. I've seen the plastic modelling done on a study where people were using library spaces, and it was to kind of encapsulate the way that they used spaces. So it's a really nice way to kind of capture lived experiences. My question was really a bit more of a meta one around thinking about students' identity research and student experience of higher education research. And how do we kind of ensure that the students that we talk to, whatever medium we're using to get them into focus groups, are kind of representative of that country, and to what extent their experience is kind of moderated by their own personal circumstances, whether they're a part-time student or you know, whether they're a particular gender, studying a particular type of discipline. And so it's a bit of a meta question, really, stepping back, thinking to what extent can we generalize, and do you see a slightly different future for this kind of research, where we actually need to do things like plasticine modeling in order to get students talking and focusing in on their own unique experience?
Thank you, Helen. No, all good questions. I suppose to start off with, I would say that I suppose it was a deliberate choice to use focus groups to reach a relatively large number of students, but also to try and get some kind of sense of of national, or whether there were any national norms. And I think one of the disadvantages is that it's very difficult then, once you've got a focus group methodology, to drill down to the individual level, because, you know, you're in a focus group, you're probably going to get group consensus, which doesn't necessarily relate to the individual experiences of all the, you know, the constituent members. So I think that is a, you know, there's a potential limitation of the method there. And I think we have been sensitive to that when we've been writing up articles from the project, that we, you know, it's very difficult to, even though, you know, we've got a focus group that is, for example, half working class students, to actually make any claims about what working class students think. So I think we've been able to make more arguments at the sort of about, you know, national norms or institutional norms, rather than drilling down to that individual level. So I think that is an important point to make. But I think what we've tried to do when we were setting up the groups was to try to make sure, first of all, in our choice of institutions, that they, you know, they were broadly representative of some of the diversity in the sector. So we didn't go just to the same type of institutions. And I think that in some countries that does relate to socioeconomic characteristics quite clearly. And then everybody who volunteered to take part in our study, we got them to fill in a kind of a little questionnaire. And then we chose people on the basis of those questionnaires to try to get a mix of kind of social characteristics that we felt were representative of that institution. And what our initial, well, our intention was, in the 3 focus groups, to divide them by discipline, so that we had some kind of similarities within each group. But for logistical reasons, that wasn't often always possible. And equally, for logistical reasons, sometimes, although we tried to get diversity within the focus groups, it wasn't always possible because of the limitations of who had actually volunteered and a whole load of practical issues that I won't bore you with now. So I think for focus group methodology, it does make it quite difficult to get down to the individual level. However, I do think that the use of plasticine models did mitigate that to some extent, because we did analyse those and as individual representations. And we got them to do that at the start of the focus group, before they'd got into group discussions. And so, you know, there was less potential, I suppose, for the individual's, you know, perspective to be swayed by the group consensus or whatever. But just, I mean, this wasn't something you asked, but it's kind of, I think it was something that I'd thought about quite a lot when we were doing it, about in terms of kind of meta issues, whether there are certain national norms about appropriate social research that would make this method less good in some countries than others. So, for example, I did think that perhaps the more formal academic culture in Poland and Germany might make it more difficult for us to use this method with students there. And so I was really interested to see how that was played out. And I think there was a little bit more reticence in those 2 countries about, you know, what on earth we were asking them to do. But actually then they did go on to make really rich models and did take it seriously and didn't think that we were really patronising them. So, you know, I think there were some interesting kind of national issues there. But no, I think your point is a good one about the kind of the balance between, you know, the individual being represented and the group.
Thank you, Helen. Rachel, I might ask the next question myself. I think one of the things that you show is that, you know, simple or one-dimensional identity tags don't work particularly well. You know, describing people under one heading is not particularly helpful. And you'd expect that if there was a convergence between the countries' identities of students, or convergence between the students in the different countries, it would probably be partial, that, you know, that they'd also have local identities, they have disciplinary identities, they retain national differences and so on. It's in relation to that possibility of commonness, though, that I'm going to pose my question. You, I think, show that there's not a commonness in relation to social economic identity as such. Is there a commonness in relation to European identity? Did you detect a sense of being European in the interview subjects, and was that similar across the countries?
That's a great question, and we didn't ask any specific questions about it, but it only cropped up in the student data in Spain, and it's something that we've actually written quite a bit about, because it was a really common theme across the different strands of the project in Spain. It wasn't just the students, but it was also the staff and the policymakers. Have they really frequently made reference, or they compared themselves to what was happening in the rest of Europe? And that just wasn't evident in any of the other countries. And I suppose, again, when we've tried to kind of theorize that or explain that in things we've written from the project, I think, again, you know, there is some literature in the compulsory school sector in Spain, and perhaps in the higher education sector as well, that actually, you know, the European project has had a particular significance in Spain in relation to education, in perhaps ways it hasn't in other European countries, you know, seen as the route out of the Franco dictatorship, and has, you know, particular symbolism in Spain in ways that it hasn't in other countries. So I think, you know, that seemed to us a kind of a plausible kind of explanation, but it was really interesting. And I think with relation to the students, it was also kind of used to frame how they felt, you know, their system wasn't doing them enough justice compared to their compatriot or their peers in other countries. And I think it also maybe links into the first question about international student mobility, because also Spain has a large number of incoming students and a large number of outgoing students as well. So I think in Spain there was perhaps greater knowledge of other European countries as well through that kind of, you know, mobility. But certainly it was only in Spain where students made explicit comparisons. And actually there are some plasticine models that are in the article that we wrote, but I just didn't have time to present today, where Spanish students made little models, for example, of globes. And they said that, you know, they felt that their experience wasn't as good as students elsewhere in Europe, or no, they were concerned that they were going to have to compete in a European labour market and their system hadn't prepared them adequately for that. Whereas that kind of sense of a European labour market or even a global labour market wasn't really mentioned in any of the other countries. So that was quite fascinating too, and leading to, you know, the further sort of distinctiveness of Spain as a country.
Thanks, Rachel. John Anker is our next questioner.
Thank you, Simon. That probably links quite well with my question. So I seem to remember from one of your previous presentations, Rachel, that some of your students had been mobile, i.e. they'd participated in mobility schemes, perhaps Erasmus or whatever. And I hope that's correct, because otherwise the premise of my question might be wrong. So I just wondered whether there are any differences in the views of students who had experienced mobility about their national system compared to those who hadn't experienced mobility. So you've just alluded to the Spanish case, but of course perceptions about other systems can be derived from all sorts of sources, can't they? Not necessarily mobility. So my question is about mobility.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure what you're referring to there, because I think we didn't, when we were collecting the data about, and I mentioned we asked everyone to complete a little questionnaire. That wasn't one of the questions that we asked them about whether they'd participated in mobility. And in the focus group, we didn't ask them any specific questions about that, but it did sometimes crop up spontaneously. But I don't think I've got a figure off the top of my head. I think it would be a relatively small minority who sort of volunteered that kind of information. And I think, you know, it was more within our interviews with policymakers that, you know, people spontaneously made comparisons between, you know, what they thought German students were like compared to students in other countries. I think within the student data, as I was saying, it was primarily Spanish students, and I think it wasn't always derived from personal mobility experiences. It was perhaps more a sense that, you know, this was just something that was discussed quite a lot in Spain, and perhaps more experience of incoming students too. So I don't think I can really add a lot more to what I, you know, said in my response to Simon, unfortunately, on that topic. I have written about kinds of mobility policies, including Erasmus, but that was very much from the sort of policy perspective. And there you certainly see differences in how Erasmus is framed depending on the national context, but that wasn't so much from the student data.
Well, thank you both. David Mills, I think we've got time for your question, so come in, David.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That's really interesting, and I'm fascinated by the Spanish situation and what's going on there. I mean, I had a little reference in the chat to wondering whether it was about this sense of being on the margins of Europe. But I wonder if I can. I wonder if I can actually ask this question now that I've got a chance. To what extent did the students' perspectives of themselves as political actors correlate in any way to the sort of role that they had within the university systems in terms of political representation, such that I imagine you're including within that student politics and student representation in the university, and the systems clearly vary quite a lot in the role that students have as actors, as sort of reps. Did you see any patterns there?
Thank you. Just to go back to your point, I haven't looked at the chat, but your point about kind of a perception about being on the margins of Europe, yes, I would, and that's something that we've written about in terms of kind of, you know, how Europe is used within Spain more generally, a kind of sense that we need to get more into the centre of things, and we do that through adopting European policies. And so actually in our analysis of European policies, you see this kind of real enthusiasm about European initiatives that you don't really see to the same degree elsewhere. So that was really noticeable, and that is certainly part of our argument, that it's kind of part of an attempt to move, you know, closer to the centre, the perceived centre of Europe. In relation to your point about political actors, in one of the institutions we went through, for a variety of reasons, we ended up going through the Students' Union to recruit some of our participants. So, but that was only one of the 54 focus groups where we had, you know, a significant number of people who were involved in kind of, you know, their institutional Students' Union. And I would say they didn't seem to have very different views from other people. So I think that, you know, across the sample as a whole, there was quite a lot of difference in knowledge of student governance and what the mechanisms for representation were in their particular institution. But I suppose when we asked them about kind of the concept of political actor, people typically interpreted that not as an institutional political actor, but as a national political actor, which I think actually says quite a lot in itself, that they saw that political activity as something kind of national or local in scale, not institutional. And we didn't follow up about kind of specific institutional things. We took the discussion sort of, you know, in terms of the things they seem to be interested in talking about, which were more sort of national issues or regional issues. So yeah, that isn't a very good answer to your question, but I think we don't have a great amount of data to say what people thought about institutional representation specifically.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I think it reflects a way in which potentially do students feel that they own, you know, are sort of have a sense of shared ownership about their institution and where it's going, as opposed to feeling alienated by it. Yeah, thank you.
I think I was about to close, Rachel, but one more question has suddenly appeared on the chat from Macron Banderlip, and perhaps we can bring Macron in. Would you like to come in, Macron? Hello?
Hi, good afternoon. Macron here. Hello.
Hi.
Yes, give us your question.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm actually interested just to find out whether there were participants, of course, like European students, but actually are coming from multiracial or biracial backgrounds. Like, say, for example, an Asian, you know, a French student who happens to have Asian roots, say. And I wonder whether the experiences of these students vis-a-vis with those students who are, you know, with pure European backgrounds have different experience studying in schools. Because I think it was rightly mentioned that maybe some center-periphery dynamics might have an impact in how they perceive themselves, their identities, and whether, you know, their being multiracial or biracial also have an impact on that. And if there are challenges, I'm also interested to find out more, like how can we support these kinds of students as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would say, although we tried to get, you know, as diverse a sample as possible, we did struggle in terms of students from ethnic minority backgrounds, and in general, we've got relatively low numbers across the sample as a whole. And as I was explaining in the answer to a question a few moments ago, because of our focus group methodology, it's actually quite difficult for us to explore whether the students that we do have from ethnic minority background did have different perspectives. Certainly when we look at the plasticine models, there isn't evidence there. But the broader discussions, because they're focus group discussions, it's a little bit difficult to tease out differences there. And I would say that on the whole, you know, there weren't striking differences of opinion within the focus groups between students of different ethnic groups. However, one of the things that was really interesting across the sample as a whole was that students themselves, because we did ask them about whether they felt student experiences did differ according to social characteristics, and we gave them examples of gender, class, ethnicity, age, and disability. And across Europe, there was a really strong sense that actually student experiences were differentiated along those lines, and your social characteristics could have a really, really big impact on your learning experience. And that contrasted quite strongly with staff perspectives, who often felt that, students were kind of, should all be treated exactly the same. And actually, their experiences didn't often differ by these social characteristics. So one of the things we've argued in one of the publications is this kind of disconnect between the views of students and those of staff. And that wasn't in all countries or all institutions, but in some, there were quite stark differences there. So I think students themselves are very sensitive to the importance of those social characteristics, but that sensitivity isn't always replicated at the staff level.
Thank you very much for taking the late question, Rachel, and thank you, Macron, for giving it. We'll have to close now, but I want to thank you, Rachel, for not only today's webinar, but your project, which has brought substantial European content to our webinar series. And it's such a pleasure to talk about Europe because there's so much to talk about. And I think we need to do more in the next few months in reaching out to our colleagues in Europe and bring them into the webinar program. Our next webinar, folks, is on Thursday, and it's about rethinking global common goods in higher education through a Chinese lens, through the lens of concept of Tianxia Weigong, which is a somewhat larger, more open concept than the way we in the Western European American tradition talk about the geopolitical world. And so, and Chinese ways of thinking and Western ways of thinking, often very different, both quite well developed, and each have got something, I think, to teach each other. So it's an interesting cross-cultural conversation, and we look forward to you being part of that conversation in 2 days' time. Once again, thank you, Trevor, as ever, for the webinar series, and thank you, Rachel, for a wonderful presentation today. Bye for now.
Bye.